And again, S&P can make it to the upper boundary of this parallel channel. Maybe complete a head and shoulders formation if we go a little higher here. It may be we reach the channel or overthrow it if momentum can remain bullish. Here's the trend line up close right here. You can see it just directly overhead. Again, momentum, we're flatline. We're going from blue to red, back to blue, but we're kind of going sideways in this range. Momentum is still positive. We'll be watching to see if we can get up there. If so, we might see divergences develop on some different signals, and even overthrow this trend line and redefine the upper boundary. This did that on the 60-minute chart with the lower boundary of the channel that I'll be showing you in this video. So momentum still positive, the trend's still positive here. We'll be watching to see if we try to reach that upper boundary. My guess is we're going to. The Dow is going to rebound and a drag on the markets, and we've seen NASDAQ and S&P go sideways. Dow has gone lower. Bearish engulfing on the S&P 500, that's not been confirmed. Again, it could still be that we hit a lower high and confirm it like we did over here. We got a lower high like we did back in July. But so far, the bearish engulfing has not been confirmed. We got a bullish inside day on Friday. And again, if it's confirmed to the upside, then I would be looking for a move to this trend line or overthrowing it to complete the channel. And the negative diversions on the RSI in the weekly time frame and on the awesome oscillator in the weekly time frame. Those negative divergences I will be showing you in this video. Now, momentum is still positive. Right here, we still have green bars reflecting momentum, positive momentum. We still have the blue line showing positive momentum. Again, I think we're headed to this upper boundary, and unless we start seeing momentum shift back to bearish, I think you got a good shot at reaching that upper boundary or maybe even overthrowing it. Bitcoin overthrew the trend line, but got a topping tail its upper channel the last time it reached it. Bitcoin is following the S&P now. It's likely going to make new highs soon, reach the upper channel again. The S&P follows Bitcoin. Other times Bitcoin follows the S&P. They do have a positive correlation. So this is where I think that we are headed, at least to this level, maybe overthrow it. Again, that could take us into the high 5,300 area, and if we overthrow it, maybe on into the 5,400 area for the S&P 500. I'm watching momentum like a hawk because, again, I've marked the turns where it's happened, and it's pretty amazing. If I just zoom out, again, you can see we're just below that upper boundary of the channel. We still have the momentum positive, but again, the turns in momentum have called, moves up, moves down, the sideways moves over here, and again, back and forth. Pretty interesting. The next turn in momentum here is going to make a U-turn and complete our divergence there in the weekly time frame on the RSI and the awesome oscillator there on those weekly charts. Now, the candlesticks reflecting the trend rather than momentum also remain green. And again, if we see momentum flip, they might start turning orange to give a warning of a reversal like they did over here. Again, you have momentum and trend signal still bullish. So I think we can go to that upper boundary of the channel on the weekly chart. Now, while momentum is still mostly positive, here the momentum line has gone flatlined, and it did turn bearish today. Now, that tells us we're either going sideways or we're going down. If we are going down, we're going to start breaking the cloud. We're going to start breaking the momentum cloud here. We're going to start breaking the 10 period that we'll see in this video, start doing technical damage. If we're just going sideways, we'll need an upward resolution to continue the advance towards the upper boundary of the channel in the weekly time frame. Right now, the balance of power is still positive. The swing trend line is still positive, representing the trend here turned after momentum line, which is representing momentum, short-term momentum, turned bearish. It turned bearish over here, but it remained bearish. If we confirm the bearish engulfing candlestick, maybe that's the case, and that's all she wrote. It could be bearish because we are going sideways just as easily. Watching the new trend line here of the channel, do we get traction here? Are we consolidating to build momentum to continue the advance? I still think we likely go higher. I think the odds favor it. The momentum line going flatline, turning bearish at the moment. It's not being validated with a drop below the momentum cloud, and other momentum signals turn bearish. Please support the channel with the link directly below. That allows me to be able to provide you this information. If you take a moment to do that, I would really appreciate it. If you follow the link below, it'll take you to a secured site. All donations are welcomed. You can donate any amount you want. Recurring donation, if you do that, I thank you. You need your help in order to make this work, so please consider helping out today. I'd appreciate it if you take a moment to do that. I thank you for that. Again, I told you back at the peak here, the Dow was forming this larger divergence with the transports and one in the more recent price action, and that led to the sell-off with the Dow. As we've seen the S&P 500 kind of drift sideways in a trading range. The Dow's hitting key support, forming divergences, which I'll show you. I'll be watching to see, does the Dow stop making new highs? But we did already have this divergence between the two, which is a huge warning sign, and this larger divergence between the two. So just something worth paying attention to if we start seeing the Dow rebound. Looks like it's going to rebound to me, and that's why I think the S&P is going to resume the advance. Now, I just want to talk about the risk model for a moment. We reached extremes when we hit the 20-week moving average, and I told you we are either going to go flatline and eventually start breaking the 20-week and get a bigger sell-off, or we're going to rebound. We ended up rebounding, and I told you to watch the gap fill. Do we get a gap fill on a lower high like we did in July, or do we get the diversion scenario like we had at the January 2020 top and February 2020, and then the January 2022 top, those two peaks. But we've seen this rise back up. We've had this winning streak now for 5 weeks. Here we are in week 6, a short trading week. I'll be watching to see if we reach that upper channel line there. But as we do, bounce off the 20-week moving average, we've seen this rebound back up again, likely going to form a divergence with this previous peak. Larger divergence that developed there. I think you're going to form this divergence here, and again, it may look something like what we had over here, where again we reached the extreme. By the time you rolled over, you had already begun a sharp decline. Again, we made a lower high. We're right at those levels right here, right now. So again, wouldn't be surprised to see a peak this week or next week. Beat the divergence on the RSI, and once that's done, we're going to begin a reversal. Great Scott! This time it's different. No, it's not. The divergences have marked the turns, the bottoms, the tops. I'm showing in the weekly time frame and have been showing. The thing here, we are watching to see where we're going to get the lower high scenario or the higher high. We got the higher high, likely still in a topping process, which I've talked about before we ever had the sell-off, before we ever had the rebound. I talked about a lower high scenario or a higher high scenario setting up reversal process for a top. So again, we don't have to see this rollover to have a peak, but it's a very good chance. There's a very good chance that we reach the upper boundary or just overthrow it. She could mark a reversal if we get a sell-off, and that's all she wrote. If we don't reach that level, the odds favor it. So again, see a divergence complete like we saw over here in January of 2022. Same thing with power swings. It is up at extremes here, and again, likely forming a multiple point divergence, very similar to what we had happen back at the January 2022 top. Again, watching to see if we rise above the doji high this week and hit that upper channel line, or if we start to turn, should momentum signals start turning back to bearish. Now, I still think you got a pretty good shot that we reach that upper boundary or even overthrow it. Signals are suggesting that the time is short. Last week we had that gap and trap on the intraday chart where we gapped higher and then we turned down throughout the session, the rest of the session closing near the lows, gapped higher the next day, went up to the 200 and went sideways. We had another little miniature gap and trap today where we gapped higher, but it didn't sell off as deep, but we came back down towards gap support right here, and again bounced. This is the rising trend line that we're hitting in the 60-minute time frame. I was watching that level with the break of the 200 period, and then we broke horizontal support right here from this low over here. So I was watching that trend line on the 60-minute chart. I told you the Dow could go back and hit the 200 period on the 60-minute chart, and that could allow the market to pull back a little bit. We had that trend line channel that we talked about over the weekend. This pullback gave us a higher low at that trend line. We had the divergence form on the 60-minute chart that gave us this gap and trap that took us back on the intraday time frame towards trying to fill this gap right here. We came just shy of it, but again, we talked about the trend line breaking and an expanded channel. Trend lines change all the time, and now we connect this low with this low, and that's where we hit today. We moved just slightly under that level there, but we have a nice looking channel still, and if we can break out of the consolidation, we are consolidating. We could still go up and hit the upper boundary of the channel in the weekly time frame, still reach that level. Now the Dow, I told you, it looked like it's getting a 5-leg push lower, and I told you I think we're going to get a rally. I told you the Dow would likely go down, start the week off and hit that 200 period. I talked about that over the weekend. With the Dow doing that, we hit this trend line on the S&P 500. S&P closed flat. It was up just 1 point after being down nearly 30 points. We were flat a lot of the day, around positive to negative, sold off, and then ended up flat for the session. But as the S&P moved back to hit this trend line, tried to get a little bottoming tail there in the form of a little spinning top on the 60-minute chart here. The Dow, its 200 period moving average. Dow still ended down 217 points, but it was down much lower at the lows of the session, down over 300. Again, got a little bottoming tail there, little candle here, and we formed a bullish falling wedge. Again, I talked about how we formed these divergences. This one gave us a sideways move. This one gave us a top here. Over the weekend, this looked like a 5-leg push lower to me, and I told you I'd expect, and we halted right there. I expected the 100 would likely be tested. It is, and we're overthrowing that level. I talked about this. We had the cloud and the momentum line, the momentum cloud and momentum line. Now resistance, we're trying to push up through the trend line ever so slightly there. If I draw that straighter. Again, I'll be watching with the bullish falling wedge and the divergence that is developing. We rise up. If we do have a 5-leg push lower, the Dow might stop making new highs. Talked about that possibility over the weekend too. If we end up getting a lower high and a Fibonacci retracement, the S&P goes higher, NASDAQ goes higher, but again, I'll let the charge lower from the March high. It sold off sharply, came back up to 40,000 area, and then retreated. And I will be watching to see what becomes of this count right here, but if we get a lower high and a 3-leg push higher, then you have potentially a 1 and a 2 lower if the Dow cannot make a new high. So I'll be watching the Dow closely with the next rally, but I do expect we're going to push above the cloud and the momentum line, and I think the Dow is suggesting a rebound for the market for the short term. S&P's gone sideways. The Dow has sold off. S&P's bouncing off the trend line. So again, if I just zoom out on the 60-minute chart, again, we're bouncing up that 200. You can see we were down, then we went up to reach the 40,000 level. Back 5 weeks ago when the S&P was hitting its 20-week moving average, that the Dow might come back and try to fill these gaps. Some of them or all of them, and it did, and 40,000 level, and then turned down here. So watching, and again, the 50 is still above the 200. We'll be watching to see if we move back towards it. Our Fibonacci retracements. Does the Dow stop making new highs, or can it make a new high? But again, you've got the bullish divergences all over the place, and the MACD looks like it's ready to recycle back up here. If we get a big rebound on the Dow, as the S&P has gone sideways, S&P and NASDAQ can push to new highs. And if I just bring up momentum right here on the Dow, take a look at this. This is, again, another bullish divergence that is forming right here. Again, we got this little bottoming tail. Dow broke out ever so slightly, have a bullish falling wedge. So again, we'll be watching. Do we just move back to the trending cloud and the 50 period and a Fibonacci retracement? Or does the Dow try to make a new high or not? Again, it does look like a 5-leg push lower. But today, with the rebound here off of the lows, we're still below the 200. But with the rebound off of the lows, the divergence did complete on many indicators. Here with momentum, again, it's likely going to recycle back up here and we'll see a rally on the Dow, and that will likely push the NASDAQ and S&P to new highs towards the upper boundary of the channel on the S&P, towards the upper boundary of the rising wedge on the NASDAQ in their weekly time frames, which I'll be showing you once again. This is suggesting to me that we're going to get a rally here in the market. And then again, can the Dow make new highs? The S&P and NASDAQ are likely going to. Sometimes the Dow does diverge the S&P 500 once in a while. But a recent high, we had a divergence between the transports and the Dow. Watching the Dow closely, but it is suggesting the market's going to attempt some kind of rally. If so, I think that the upper channel line is tested on the weekly chart of the S&P. NASDAQ composite reached 17,000, closing above it for the first time today. The Dow was down just over 0.5%, down 217 points. S&P was flat. NASDAQ was up 99 points, up just over 0.5% to reach that level. The Russell was down. VIX was up 4.5% to just under 13 at 12.92. NASDAQ 100, it ended up about 66 points higher. 61 points higher. It was about 1/3 of 1% higher. It's forming a rising wedge. I think, again, the S&P has this channel. Will push it into the upper boundary channel on the weekly time frame. We now have this rising wedge, and again, sometimes you get overthrows with rising wedges. We can come up here and move towards the upper boundary of the larger rising wedge on the weekly chart for NASDAQ. The divergence form with the gap and trap from late last week, it took us back to the 50-period moving average in the cloud here to begin to form this rising wedge pattern. NASDAQ still holding above the 10-period moving average in the daily time frame, and again, I think we're forming this larger head and shoulders pattern. I think we're going to go higher and then begin to come back down to this level here. I think by the time we do, we'll reach the 200-period moving average, which is rising here in the daily time frame. Now, we got a possible bearish candlestick on S&P and NASDAQ 100. Again, this is the NASDAQ daily chart. Little shaven head or hanging man, sloppy hanging man candlestick there, but it could as easily be a bottoming tail if we try to move to a new high. We didn't exceed the previous peak. Neither has the S&P 500. They could do that if we see the Dow attempt to rebound. I think that's probably going to be the case. If we do move towards the upper Bollinger Bands, it's kind of overthrown on this chart here. You can't see it, but we can move towards the upper boundaries. Trend lines on the NASDAQ, that is a rising wedge. If we move towards the upper boundary of this rising wedge, may end up forming a larger divergence. This divergence gave us this push back down. The next push higher here might form a larger divergence on the RSI or a brand new one. If we move towards the upper boundary of the rising wedge here, move towards the upper Bollinger Band in the daily time frame, you're setting up a head formation, possible head and shoulders pattern. And if we look at our log scaling, that could take us up to this rising wedge upper boundary here in the weekly time frame, which I think is where we're likely headed. We could see that this week. We have a winning streak, a 5-week winning streak. I think if the momentum can continue, we can peak there possibly this week, next week. I think that's where we're headed, and I think it will complete this divergence as I've talked about in the weekly time frame. The last divergence was an over 8% drop. We consolidated. That's a potential right shoulder. This one right here could produce the start of a reversal and could allow the NASDAQ to peak with the bearish rising wedge with a possible head and shoulders in the daily. And again, might be, even if we don't form a right shoulder, it might be a double top pattern with an overthrow of the second peak. But again, you got a possible head and shoulders here, a rising wedge here in the weekly time frame. These divergences have played out, marking tops and bottoms. Short-term top here, major bottom. Very good chance this is going to mark a major top with the divergence that is forming on the RSI. Because it's taking its time playing out. I told you when we were selling off, when we were going sideways and selling off, I told you back over here and down over here, we may form a lower high scenario, we may get a higher high scenario. I told you if we got the higher high, this trend line comes into play on NASDAQ and the trend line of the upper channel on the S&P 500. Now, By the way, the Dow is hitting the 20-week moving average again. The Dow turned off of this trend line in the weekly time frame. I told you I was watching these two trend lines on the Dow and S&P. S&P slightly above it, NASDAQ overthrew it, and the Dow turned off of it. So again, I'll be watching. If the Dow rallies back up, I'll be watching that trend line. It may be close, but no cigar. If we have a 5-way push lower, we may get a lower high and get something that looks like that. I'll be watching the Dow closely because, again, it does look like the Dow is going to attempt to bounce. If it does, positions may already be done on the Dow if we don't move to a new high, and it just may get a lower high. We may still get a higher high, but I'm just telling you, it looks like a 5-way push lower. That wave is totally speculation. So again, then I'm keeping my eye on there in the 60-minute time frame. Now, as the S&P is bouncing off of this trend line, again, we pull back to develop it, and we're still in this trading range. I think we're going to get traction here. 2 has a possible head and shoulders pattern that's setting up like NASDAQ. Again, I think we're going to come up, hit this upper boundary. We may even overthrow it and redefine the upper boundary here. It is possible that we exclude the shadow in the weekly time frame, which would take us up just a little bit higher. So again, I'll be watching the trend line as it stands now. I'll be watching to see if we overthrow it, and it very well could. Again, we define the lower boundary of the channel on the S&P 60-minute chart. Trend lines change, channels redefine themselves all the time. Now, the MACD in the daily time frame has not yet rolled over. The RSI has pulled back. I think you're going to end up forming a little divergence here. I think you're going to end up forming a little divergence on the histogram down here that will cause the MACD to turn back up and eventually roll over. Whoops, sorry about that. I think the screen just went blank there for a second. But again, I'm watching potentially these head and shoulder patterns that are forming on NASDAQ and S&P 500, and again into the upper channel here, which again may be overthrown on the S&P. Here it is up close. We're bouncing off the 10-period moving average in the daily time frame. Again, the last bear flags we had, the one here, we got a lower high, got a very similar looking candlestick to this. So again, I'll be watching. Do signals start turning back to bearish? And that's all she wrote, or do we get one more push into the upper boundary of the channel, weekly time frame? Same thing over here. We had a bearish engulfing candlestick. We got a lower high there in July, got a lower high here after the little miniature double top right here in early April. So does it play out that way and we start turning down, losing the 10 period, or do we get one more push higher and redefine that channel line to the upper boundary of the channel on the S&P in the weekly time frame? I think the histogram is likely going to end up remaining positive and tick back up, and then I'll be watching for diversions to try to develop on the histogram and the RSI and other indicators. You see it up close again, both hanging man or bottoming tail if we can get the traction, very similar to what we have on the NASDAQ, more of a kind of a shaven head look on the NASDAQ, where very, very sloppy hanging man. But again, these could very well easily be bottoming tails in a sideways consolidation and still try to take us up to the upper channel line. So if we establish this trend line now as a bottom for a higher low, another higher low on this 3-touch lower boundary of the channel, and again, S&P might make it to this upper boundary here. We didn't quite reach it before. We're consolidating sideways. We had a doji for the week. For last week's chart, we'll be watching. The doji could be a reversal or a continuation. And again, we might go a little higher. We might even overthrow the upper boundary, as I've said, and redefine the upper boundary. If we exclude the shadow down here, we could easily do that. Again, told you just over 5 weeks ago that very well could mark a bottom. I was looking for a lower high at some point to either get the gap fill 5,200 or go back up and hit this trend line. I've talked about this at great length and detail for months. Told you if we got the lower high, we would do what we did in July and get this confirmation of a lower high. If we got the higher high and hit the upper channel, then we would get a top like what we had here. Now again, at the 2022 top, we went higher for a couple weeks. Second week we broke to a new high. We reversed. So this is now our third week now above the previous high there in March. I told you we can, straddle along the trend line here for a little while, stay here, and then begin to turn. We could turn soon divergence completes, and my guess is we're going to hit the trend line or overthrow it, even overthrow it and get a topping tail and close the week right back at it. Bitcoin did, and it's fascinating. Bitcoin has bounced off the 20-week moving average. It's a few weeks behind the S&P. Bitcoin bounced off the trend line. So did the S&P 500. Bitcoin is forming this larger channel. So is the S&P 500. They have a positive correlation. My pin kind of got messed up there, but you can see what I'm talking about here with this channel. Pretty fascinating. The divergence here is going to produce, all likelihood, a reversal of the trend, just as it did over here back in 2020, as I've talked about. While the market was up last week on the S&P and the NASDAQ with the winning streak, the 5-week winning streak, the Dow was down. Watching these divergences on the oscillators in the weekly time frame, the Dow is starting with a red bar here. We had the green bar ahead of the S&P and NASDAQ. The Dow went towards 40,000, but then we reversed. Still a blue bar reflecting the trend, but it was a big red bar of a 2.5% sell-off. We're seeing the stochastic start rolling over. Now remember, the week is young, and you only get one bar per week. So if we bounce here off the 10-week moving average, we still may end up with a green bar. We still may prevent the stochastic from rolling over, but it is forming a divergence. Again, we could even rally back up and still have a red bar, as I've talked about. And again, I talked about over the weekend, we had a green bar and we had a sell-off. Again, looking for this divergence to complete on the Dow. Maybe it's done if the Dow stops making new highs. But again, we'll be watching. We start losing the 10-week and we can't get the rally that I'm looking for, and signals all begin to start turning bearish on the S&P, NASDAQ, then that's all she wrote, and close but no cigar for those trend lines on the weekly chart. But my guess is that the odds favor likely going to reach them, because momentum can remain bullish. I wanted to show you here on the weekly chart with the Dow, we're starting the week off with the red bar with the oscillator and a rollover in the stochastic. We'll see what it looks like by the end of the week. My guess is the Dow is going to rally back up, but again, it may end up being that we get a lower high if we do have a 5-leg push lower on the 60-minute chart. S&P starts a week off here. Again, the short trading week. Doji last week. Again, the S&P was flat. It was just up 1 point. But we start the week off with another green oscillator bar. Again, we're likely forming a divergence here. MACD is still negative. It may not turn back up. It may just form a lower high below the signal line. It may turn back up above it and then turn right back down. That's what it did over here at the 2022 top. Again, we formed this divergence. And on the MACD, it turned up ever so slightly and then just quickly turned right back down off of that signal line. Eventually, we dropped 13% real fast, and it evolved into a 15% decline before any kind of meaningful bounce. Lost a 10-week moving average here in the weekly time frame. That's what we need to be watching for. Do we lose the 10-week moving average and then stay below it? A reversal of conditions. So again, looking very similar here, but the oscillator also looks very similar. Again, it formed a divergence there. But I still think we can go higher. Again, if we start a reversal bar, and it could happen that way, the doji could be an evening star reversal. You have a wide range bar, a doji, and then we can get a big red bar this week. That's possible. Momentum signals all start turning bearish. My guess is that this is still under construction, along with the divergence on the RSI here in the weekly time frame on the S&P. Again, our stochastic not rolling over yet, but again, likely to form a divergence similar to what we have on the Dow weekly time frame that I just showed you. Same thing here for the NASDAQ. Again, the MACD not turning back above the signal line yet. It may, but again, you've got the divergence going on here. And again, it may not be done if we hit that upper boundary of the rising wedge, which is where I think we're likely headed, unless we begin to see signals start to reverse immediately sooner rather than later. I do think that the divergences will produce a reversal and complete a topping process. Weekly chart here. Daily chart, NASDAQ still has green oscillator bars. We still have a bullish reversal of conditions. We're holding above the 10 period. We got a kind of a shaven head, kind of a candlestick here today in a sideways consolidation. We'll see if we try to go higher or not. You start losing the 10 period. You start getting a bearish reversal of conditions. Momentum starts flipping back to bearish. If it remains bullish, we can go higher. The S&P has red bars it still may get green bars. It still may go higher and even form a divergence that looks something like that later over the next week or two here of trading. It may form an immediate divergence if we do end up going higher. Again, we're trying to bounce off the 10-period moving average. We still have a bullish reversal of conditions. We're bouncing off that 10 period.